Welcome back. Today, we are officially kicking off Phase 3 of our roadmap, which is the Hidden Texts arc. We're asking the big questions. What did the founders of our most fundamental beliefs hide, lose, or suppress? What exactly was left on the cutting room floor when the official versions of history were being put together? Okay, let's dive into this, completely bypassing any agenda today, and start with literally the most incredible discovery story in the history of archaeology.
Somewhere in the Judean desert, sometime in the winter of 1946, a teenage boy, his name is Mohammed Ed-Thib, he is Bedouin and he is just looking for a lost goat, picks up a rock and throws it into a cave on the cliff face above the Dead Sea. Now he is not thinking about history, he is thinking about the goat. But he hears the rock land inside the cave and then he hears something else, the sound of pottery breaking. He doesn't go in immediately. He comes back the next day with a friend, and they squeeze through this narrow entrance, and in the dark they find a row of tall clay jars. Most are empty, a few are not. Inside, wrapped in linen cloth, are rolls of leather, ancient, dry, extraordinarily preserved by 2,000 years of desert air. He takes them. He has absolutely no idea what they are. He will eventually sell them in the Bethlehem antiquities market for what amounts to a few days' wages. But the texts he carried out of that cave will be worth more, in every sense that matters, than almost anything else discovered in the 20th century. They are the Dead Sea Scrolls. They had been sealed in those jars since approximately 68 CE, the year the Roman army destroyed the community that had hidden them. 2,000 years in the dark, waiting. And a boy looking for a goat found them. That is how history works sometimes, not with grand ceremony, with a thrown rock and a broken jar.
And this brilliantly illustrates the massive, awe-inspiring scale of time we're dealing with here. Think about it. These texts, set in absolute darkness, completely silent, from 68 CE all the way until 1946. That is 2 entire millennia. And then, in a sudden, totally accidental moment triggered by a stray animal, they're just thrust right back into the modern world. But the discovery in 1946 was really only the beginning. It would actually take nearly another half-century, all the way until 1991, for the world to get full access to what was found. Because that single thrown rock, it triggered a massive, frantic search across the entire region. It's the ultimate spark of curiosity. What started in one single cave quickly expanded into 11 caves. Scholars and Bedouins alike ultimately uncovered around 900 manuscripts, and these were broken down into an overwhelming 25,000 individual pieces of parchment and papyrus. 25,000. They were written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. We're talking about an archaeological find of absolutely unprecedented scale, effectively turning the desert into a massive jigsaw puzzle of human history.
And honestly, the impact of this entire discovery really comes down to one single number: 1,000. See, among the very first finds was the Great Isaiah Scroll. Now, before this cave was opened, the oldest known complete manuscript of the Hebrew Bible dated to around the 10th century. But the Great Isaiah Scroll, that dated to approximately 125 BCE, meaning it predated our previously oldest known copies by an astonishing 1,000 years. For a full millennium, there was a massive historical silence in the manuscript record. Scholars literally had no way of knowing if the text had been faithfully copied over all those centuries. But the Great Isaiah Scroll bridged that massive gap. And what it proved was incredible. The text was roughly 95% identical to the versions that form the basis of our modern translations. The transmission across 1,000 years was extraordinarily faithful.
Let's move to Section 1, a community in the desert, and see how this builds. Because naturally we have to ask, who actually wrote and hid these texts in the first place? To understand the scrolls, you really have to understand the people who valued them enough to meticulously seal them in jars. They were known as the Qumran community, and most scholars identify them as a group called the Essenes. Now, they weren't just random desert hermits. They were a deeply devoted, intensely strict separatist movement. They had actually fled Jerusalem because they believed the mainstream temple priesthood had become entirely corrupt and ritually invalid. And the rules this community lived by were intense. As documented in texts like the Community Rule and the War Scroll, joining this group meant you effectively surrendered your ordinary existence. You gave up all your private wealth upon entry. You practiced daily ritual immersion in water to stay pure. You shared communal meals of bread and wine that were presided over by a priest. And their entire worldview, their theology, was framed as a literal cosmic battle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. And they weren't just speaking metaphorically here. The War Scroll actually details their preparation for a literal, apocalyptic 40-year war against the Romans and demonic forces. They fully believed the end of the world was coming in their lifetime, and they were preparing for it systematically.
Now, what's really interesting about this comparison is the incredible historical tension it creates. Look at how the practices of this isolated Jewish sect at Qumran, written decades before the New Testament, heavily mirror early Christianity. Ritual immersion, that heavily mirrors John the Baptist. Shared property, that mirrors the early church in the book of Acts. The priestly bread and wine meal looks incredibly like the Eucharist, and that light versus darkness theology is right out of the Gospel of John. This is exactly the kind of thing that made institutions so nervous. Now, to be absolutely clear here, the current scholarly consensus does not say that Jesus was an Essene or that Christianity was just copied from Qumran. But what it does prove is that early Christian practices didn't just appear out of thin air. They emerged from a deeply contested, incredibly rich and diverse Jewish sectarian landscape that was already experimenting with these exact ideas.
But let's take a quick pivot here, because amidst all the heavy theology, the doomsday prophecies, and the strict monastic rules, the excavators in 1952 found something in Cave 3 that completely broke the mold. I'm talking about a genuine, Indiana Jones-style mystery that completely resets the narrative. What about the treasure?
Enter the Copper Scroll. Every other text found in those caves was written on leather or papyrus, but not this one. This one was inscribed on a 2.4-meter-long sheet of nearly pure copper, and it was so brittle and heavily corroded when they found it that it actually took years just to figure out how to open the thing. It had to be taken to a laboratory in Manchester, England, and extremely carefully cut into strips with a specialized saw just to be read. And when they finally translated it, it wasn't a hymn, it wasn't a prophecy, it was a list. 64 specific geographical locations detailing exactly where massive amounts of buried treasure were hidden.
And the amount of treasure listed on this scroll is staggering. We are talking about an estimated 65 to 200 tons of gold and silver. To put that into perspective, it's a sum so massive it would easily be the largest known treasure deposit in the ancient world. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. Not a single ounce of it has ever been found. Not one. Scholars have debated this for decades. Was it just a utopian fantasy, like a liturgical document of imaginary wealth? Or, as some strongly suspect, is it the actual inventory of the Jerusalem temple treasury, desperately hidden away before the Romans destroyed the city in 70 CE? The locations described on the copper match valleys and cisterns that either no longer exist or are buried deep beneath modern Jerusalem. So to this day, the mystery remains entirely unsolved.
Section 2. The 50-year academic scandal. Because as crazy as the mystery of the Copper Scroll is, it's honestly nothing compared to the human drama that followed the broader discovery. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told, and it gives this whole explainer its absolute urgency. It's about the shocking institutional embargo that literally locked away the most significant religious texts of the century.
So here's what happened. After the initial discoveries, the most vital material, particularly the 15,000 fragments from Cave 4, was handed over to a small, totally unaccountable international team of predominantly Catholic scholars based at the École Biblique in Jerusalem. And then, almost nothing happened. For decades, this tiny group held heavily restricted access to these fragments. They treated them as their own personal fiefdoms, producing very little published work and strictly denying any access to outside scholars. By the 1980s, this had blown up into a massive scholarly scandal. The greatest theological find of the modern era was literally being hoarded by a handful of men.
But the dam finally broke in 1991, and it broke dramatically. The Huntington Library in California, which had quietly held a set of reference photographs of the fragments, just unilaterally announced they were opening access to all qualified scholars. At the exact same time, an unauthorized, computer-reconstructed concordance of the texts was published. Overnight, that exclusive scholarly monopoly completely collapsed. And this forced opening was desperately urgent in a very physical sense. Excavation and exposure to modern air were actively deteriorating these incredibly fragile parchments. Getting them out of the hands of a few hoarders and into the broader academic community was a literal race against physical destruction, a scramble to digitize and save them before the history turned to dust.
So, the crucial point is, why were they hiding them in the first place? Well, for 50 years, conspiracy theories ran wild. People naturally expected secret gospels that would completely destroy modern faith, or undeniable proof that Jesus survived the cross, or evidence of some massive church cover-up. But when the monopoly collapsed and the texts were finally published for everyone to see, the actual findings were very different. Instead of a cover-up, we found incredibly rich historical context, brilliant translation variations, but absolutely zero faith-destroying bombshells. The scandal wasn't some malicious suppression of dangerous, forbidden theology. It was actually a stark, very human lesson. Institutional hoarding of information, even if it's just born out of scholarly inertia and ego, creates outcomes that are completely indistinguishable from deliberate, malicious suppression.
Section 3. What the texts actually changed. Because if these scrolls didn't destroy major religions as everyone suspected, then what exactly is the lasting impact of these jars found out in the desert?
Well, what the texts actually changed was our fundamental understanding of the foundations of Western religion. They didn't destroy faith. They grounded it in historical reality. They revealed a messy, vastly richer, and wildly contested world of early Judaism and early Christianity. And honestly, it is deeply emotional to realize that all of this profound knowledge only survived because a doomed community, facing total annihilation by the Roman army, took the desperate step of sealing their library in clay jars and hiding it in the dark. They didn't survive, but their library did. It's an act of preservation that succeeded beyond all reasonable expectation.
Muhammad ed-Dib, the shepherd boy who found the first scrolls, lived until 2004. He gave interviews periodically throughout his life, a quiet man, slightly bewildered by the attention, who described the discovery in practical terms and seemed genuinely unable to grasp the scale of what his thrown rock had found. I find that deeply moving. The most important archaeological discovery of the 20th century was made by a boy who was just looking for a goat, who had no idea what he had found, and who lived his whole life without fully understanding the profound significance of one afternoon in a cave by the Dead Sea. History works like that more often than we admit.
The Essenes hid their texts in caves to protect them from an invading army. But what about texts that were hidden in plain sight? Texts suppressed not by foreign empires, but by the very institutions meant to preserve faith? What else was hidden? Well, in our next explainer, we are traveling to Egypt, 1945, to a discovery made by two brothers digging for fertilizer. They found texts the official church actively ordered destroyed. The ones they missed are going to fundamentally change the story all over again. Join us for Day 62, the Gnostic Gospels. Trust me, you will not want to miss it.